The cowboy caught the little girl who stole his food, but her story broke his heart. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun had already dropped low, leaving the flats in a dull wash of gray, the kind that made every sound carry further than it should. The cowboy crouched by his fire, stirring the last of the beans in the blackened pot. He was a man past 35, lean from years of work, his face darkened by wind and dust, with lines at the eyes that hadn't been put there by laughter. He kept his hat pulled low, a habit since the day he buried his brother and left town for good. No one came out this far unless they wanted to be alone, and that was exactly what he'd chosen. Until now, he heard it first, just the scrape of tin on iron, faint under the crackle of firewood. His hand went still, ladle held mid-turn. His mind ran through the quick possibilities: varmint, coyote, stranger, and his pulse thudded once hard in his chest. He stood slow, quiet on the packed dirt, and saw her. She was small, maybe 8, maybe 10, barefoot, her dress hanging loose and dirty. Her hair stuck to her face in clumps, and her hands were in the pot, grabbing beans so fast they fell against her wrists. When she saw him, she froze, wide-eyed, and he saw the fear there. Real fear, not the kind a child puts on when caught in mischief. He stayed where he was, weighing what to do. He could run her off, maybe even ought to. Stray children brought questions, questions brought neighbors, and neighbors brought trouble. But she didn't run. She hunched over the pot, cramming what she had in her mouth, coughing, tried to swallow. Something in him shifted at the sight. She wasn't just stealing. She was surviving. That he stepped forward enough to be seen, but kept his hands open and away from his belt. "Easy," he said, his voice low, calm as he could make it. She didn't trust the word. She clutched the beans tighter like he might take them. He watched the tremble in her arm and decided quick. He set down the ladle, reached for an extra tin plate from his saddle roll, and ladled beans into it until it was near full. Then he sat on the dirt, not between them but closer to her. "Yours," he said. For a moment she didn't move, just stared, her breathing ragged. Then, slow, she edged closer and crouched, never taking her eyes off him, and grabbed the plate. She ate in quick gulps, not even tasting it. He sat back on his heels and let her finish, the firelight throwing both of their shadows across the ground. When she was done, she wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist and glanced around, like she might have to run. He saw the worn-out shoes, the holes at the knees of her dress, the scabs on her shins. He'd seen children left like this before, after raids or sickness. He thought about asking where her folks were, but stopped. He didn't need the story right now. He already knew enough. Instead, he pointed to the fire. "Sit," he said. She hesitated, then sank down on the stump across from him. He pulled a spare blanket from the mule's pack, shook the dust out, and held it out. She hesitated again, then snatched it and wrapped it around herself. She sat stiff, like she was ready to bolt, but she didn't run. The man leaned back against the wagon wheel and watched her over the flames. He wasn't sure why he hadn't sent her off yet. He told himself it was just until morning, just so she wouldn't freeze out there. But as he banked the fire for the night and laid his bedroll where he could keep an eye on her, he knew he'd already made a choice. Tonight, she stayed. The night passed in broken pieces, the fire sinking low and the wind rattling the brush, but the girl didn't run. The cowboy woke twice, checking she was still there, her small frame curled under the blanket near the heat. Each time he felt the same tight pull in his chest, relief mixed with something else he couldn't name. At first light, he rose, raked coals back to life, and set the coffee pot on the stones. When he turned, she was awake, sitting up slow, watching him with that same guarded look, ready to run if he changed his mind about her staying. He poured water over his hands and scrubbed the sleep from his face, then filled the tin plate again and set it near her. She ate slower this time, but still kept her back curved like she expected to be shoved away any second. "Where's home?" he asked, his voice quiet. She hesitated, eyes fixed on the food, then shook her head once. "Gone," she said. That was all she gave him, but it was enough. He didn't press for more. There was time for questions later. When she finished, he pointed toward the mule, who was already nosing at the ground for grain. "Come," he said, and stood waiting until she followed. He showed her how to untie the water skin, how to carry it without spilling, how to press the cork back so it wouldn't leak. Her small hands trembled, but she did as he showed, glancing back at him after every step to be sure he wasn't about to bark at her or send her away. "Fill it," he said, pointing toward the tree line where he knew the creek cut through. She hesitated, then went barefoot over cold ground, the blanket still around her shoulders. He stayed by the fire but kept his eyes on the trees until she came back, wet to the elbows but with the skin mostly full. He took it from her, checked the cork, and gave a short nod. It was the first time he'd given her anything close to praise. She stood a little straighter. He packed the pot and cinched the saddle, slow and deliberate, letting her see there was no rush, no storm driving them out. "You ride," he said, lifting her by the waist and setting her up behind the packs. She clung to the strap, stiff at first, until the mule started forward and she realized he wasn't about to throw her off. The trail back to the cabin was quiet except for the squeak of leather and the creak of wheels. He kept an eye on the horizon, the habit of a man who had been ambushed once before and never forgot, but the road stayed empty. He thought about the cabin waiting ahead, the one-room space that had been only his since the day he built it. He wondered what it would feel like to have another person inside, especially a child. He told himself this was only until he figured out where she came from, if there was kin somewhere, but the thought of handing her over to some stranger tightened his jaw. When they reached the rise, the cabin came into view, a plain box of weathered boards, the corral leaning to one side, the door sagging on its hinges. He saw her eyes move over everything, taking it all in, and he wondered what it looked like to someone who hadn't had a roof for a while. Inside, the air smelled of cold ashes and dust. He opened the shutters to let in light, then shut them against the wind. He set the rules because they had to be clear now. No wandering after dark, no touching the rifle. Ask before you take the axe. She nodded, wide-eyed, serious. He put beans on the stove, cut a chunk of dried meat, set bread to warm, all the while aware of her standing near the door, hands wrapped tight in the blanket. When he finally turned, he saw the question on her face. Not about food, but about whether she was allowed to stay. "You sleep here tonight," he said simply. Something in her shoulders loosened. She stepped closer to the stove, palms out to catch the heat. He pulled an old shirt from a peg, cut the hem with his knife, tied a rope around her waist so it wouldn't drag. She stood still, letting him work, eyes fixed on the floor. When he stepped back and nodded, she touched the hem like she needed to be sure it was real. That night, he laid his bedroll near the door and gave her the cot with his coat rolled for a pillow. She turned on her side, staring at the wall until her breathing evened. He watched her for a long time, thinking about the road that had brought her here, about the people who hadn't stopped for her before he did. Then he reached over and put another stick in the stove. The fire caught slow, filling the room with a soft glow, and for the first time in months, the cabin didn't feel entirely empty. Morning broke clear and cold, the kind that stung bare skin and made breath puff white in the air. The cowboy was already up, boots on, checking the yard when the girl stirred. She sat up slow, rubbing her eyes, glancing around as if to be sure she was still in the cabin and not back out on the road. He saw the doubt in her face and made sure his voice was steady when he said, "Come on, work to do." She climbed down from the cot, barefoot, the rope-belted shirt hanging almost neat now. He handed her the bucket and showed her the yoke hanging by the door. "Creeks down past the cottonwoods. Don't spill it." He stepped outside with her, walked partway until the trail was clear, then let her go on alone. She glanced back 3 times before she disappeared into the trees. He waited, leaning on the fence rail, ears tuned for trouble. When she came back, carrying the bucket in both hands, half sloshed out but still plenty left, he just nodded once. "Good," he said. And she almost smiled before catching herself. He gave her a piece of bread from the cupboard and pointed to the broom. "Sweep." She started clumsy, dragging the bristles cross-grain, but he stopped her, showed her to push with the grain of the floorboards. She corrected herself without complaint and kept at it until the dust was in a neat pile. By the time she was done, he had the fire up and coffee on. He handed her a tin plate with beans and meat and sat opposite her at the table, both of them eating quiet. When a meal was over, he set his cup down and got the tools. Corral's broke, he said. Post needs setting. You hold it. Outside, the corral leaned where a winter wind had pushed through. He placed the post, put the spike, and showed her where to stand. Hands here, shoulder against the wood. Don't move till I say. She braced her small frame against the post while he swung the hammer. The ring of iron made her flinch the first time, but she held steady after that. When it was set, he checked the rail and said, straight enough. It was the first praise he'd given her out loud, and she didn't hide her grin this time. They moved on to the mule. He handed her the curry comb. Small circles. Don't scrape on. She worked slow at first, then found the rhythm, brushing dust from the mule's coat until it shone dully in the light. The mule flicked an ear but stood still, and the man said, good, again. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked pleased. Through the afternoon, he gave her small tasks, stacking kindling, rinsing the pot, hanging socks by the stove edge to dry. Each time she waited for his nod, and each time she got it, her face loosened a little more. He saw how hungry she was for any sign she was doing it right, and he gave her what he could. When evening came, he cut a small shirt from another peg, better than the first, and showed her how to tie the rope belt so it wouldn't slip. She touched the fabric, softer than what she had worn in days, and whispered, thank you, almost too low to hear. He didn't answer, just set the table with 2 plates this time instead of 1. That night, as the stove ticked and the cabin filled with a steady warmth, she ate slower, no longer shoving each bite like it might be taken from her. When she was done, she gathered the tin plates without being asked and put them on the shelf. He watched her climb into the cot, roll on her side, and pull the blanket up under her chin. For a long time, she lay awake staring at the fire's glow. Then her breathing went even, and she slept. The man stayed sitting at the table, elbows on his knees, looking at the small cot against the wall. He'd told himself this was temporary, just until he found where she belonged or got her down. But the way she had stood against the fence post, the way she'd looked when he said, good, it stayed with him. He didn't say it out loud, but he already knew he wasn't planning to send her anywhere. Not now. Not while she still had that look of someone waiting to be sent away. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4, where they make their first trip to town together, facing the stares, gossip, and questions, and we see the cowboy make the first real choice to claim her as his responsibility in front of others? This would deepen the tension and show the turning point where their bond becomes public. The next morning came cold but clear, the kind that made the earth sound hollow under boots. The cowboy woke before first light, raked coals into a glow, and put on coffee. The girl stirred on the cot and sat up without being called, pulling the rope-belted shirt tight at the waist. He watched her pause, as if checking whether she was still allowed to stay. Eat, he said simply, setting a plate on the table. She came quick, sat straight, and ate in calm bites, no longer hunched like she expected to be chased away. After breakfast, he checked the cupboard, beans running low, flour almost gone, only 1 strip of salt pork left. He glanced at the girl's feet, saw the bruised skin through the holes in her shoes. It decided the day for him. Down, he said. She stiffened at the word, clutching the edge of the table. He saw the fear in her face, fear of being taken away or handed off, and shook his head once. You ride with me. She said nothing, but she followed when he hitched the mule. He lifted her up to the wagon bench, steadying her by the waist, and climbed up beside her. The road into town was rutted from spring thaw, the wagon creaking as they went. She kept her hands tight in her lap at first, but when the mule stumbled, she caught herself by grabbing his sleeve and left her hand there until the road smoothed. When they reached the main street, the square was alive with sound. Wagon wheels, men talking on porches, a dog barking somewhere near the livery. The girl's eyes darted everywhere, taking in faces, shoulders tensing each time someone looked too long. He kept the mule steady, slow, and guided it straight to the general store. Inside, the air was close and smelled of coffee, lamp oil, and leather. The clerk looked up, eyes flicking from a man to the girl and back, but said nothing. The cowboy gave his list in short words: flour, salt, a pair of used boots if there were any, needle and thread, coffee if the price wasn't high. The clerk brought the boots out of a crate, worn but solid, and set them on the counter. 50 cents, he said. The man counted out coins without haggling. He handed the boots to the girl, who held them tight against her chest like something precious. As they stepped outside, a ranch hand leaned against the post, squinting at the girl. "That yours?" he asked, his voice too casual. The cowboy didn't look at him, just adjusted the mule's lead rope. "She's with me," he said, calm but final. Whatever the hand had been about to say died on his lips, and he looked away. The girl glanced up at the man, saw his jaw tight, and seemed to take a breath for the first time since they'd come into town. They made one last stop at the courthouse. The clerk there knew the man by sight, didn't ask questions, just brought out the ledger. "You looking to note a ward?" the clerk asked. The cowboy nodded. The girl stood still, clutching the boots so hard her knuckles whitened. The man signed his name slow and careful. The clerk blotted the ink and stamped the page. "That's all there is to it," he said, tearing off a slip for the man to keep. The cowboy folded it and handed it to the girl. She stared at it for a long second before sliding it into the boot she wasn't wearing yet, as if that made it safer. The ride home was quiet, the girl sitting taller on the bench now, hands resting on the boots in her lap. When they reached the cabin, he lifted her down again and saw her step inside without hesitation. She put the boots by the stove to warm and then turned to him, waiting for the next thing. He set the flour and salt on the shelf, put the needle packet in the tin, and said, "Soup tonight." She smiled, small but real, and went to fetch water without being told. He watched her go, the paper in her boot, the fear mostly gone from her shoulders, and for the first time he felt the cabin might be more than a place to sleep. It might start feeling like a home again. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 5, where the bond between them deepens further, showing her helping with spring chores, learning new tasks, and the cowboy beginning to think not just about keeping her safe today, but about building a life that includes her? This could also bring in the first outside tension, gossip, someone questioning the legality of her staying to raise the stakes. The days after their trip to town felt different, as if the cabin itself had settled into a new rhythm. The girl now woke without being called, pulling on the rope-belted shirt and then the new boots, which were a little big but lay snug. She moved with more purpose, sweeping the floor in straight lines, gathering kindling in the exact place he had told her, waiting by the door for the bucket before he even asked. The cowboy noticed all of it but didn't say much. He wasn't a man given to praise, but each time she did a job right, he gave her a short nod or a quiet good, and she carried those words with her all day, work stretched longer with the weather turning soft. He took her outside to mend the broken rail on the south fence. "Hold level," he said, handing her the tool. She planted her boots and braced her small frame against the post while he swung the hammer. The sound rang out across the pasture, but she didn't flinch this time, keeping the bubble straight until he grunted approval. She smiled openly now when he said it was square, wiping sweat from her temple with her sleeve and standing a little taller before moving to the next task. When they were done, he set the rake in her hands and showed her how to drag the winter debris from the yard into a neat pile. She worked steadily, her hair sticking to her neck, her thin arms straining but never stopping. He saw her glance toward him every so often, checking his face, and when she caught him watching, she didn't drop her eyes like before. She just kept going. Inside, she had started to take charge of small things without asking, stacking tin plates in order, hanging socks so they would dry evenly, even brushing crumbs off the table before he returned from the yard. Once, she found a bent spoon in the tin box and worked it straight against the table edge. When he saw it, he didn't speak, but he left it on the hook next to his own, two side by side. Their quiet was broken one afternoon when a rider passed slow along the road and stopped at the fence. The cowboy stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands, and the girl froze in the doorway. "Heard tell you got company out here," the rider said, his tone half curious, half accusing. The cowboy didn't raise his voice. "You heard right," he said. The man on the horse looked toward the cabin door. "Word is that girl came through town weeks back, picking scraps behind the boarding house. Someone might come asking." The cowboy stood still, boots planted. "Paper signed," he said evenly. "Clerk's stamp, judge's mark. She's mine to look after now." The rider stared a long moment, then shrugged, just saying what's being said. He tugged his reins and rode on. The girl stayed in the doorway until the horse was a speck on the road. When she looked at him, her face was pale. He stepped past her into the cabin, unhooked the ledger slip from its tin, and set on the table where she could see it. "Still good," he said. She came close, touching the edge of the paper with one finger before sliding it back into the tin carefully. That night, she ate without rushing and even offered to wash the plates. He let her, sitting at the table and watching how serious she was about getting every bit of ash out of the pan. When she was done, she placed them on the shelf with quiet pride. Before turning in, he looked around the cabin. The swept floor, the lined-up plates, the boots by the door, the small blanket folded neat on the cot, and felt a stillness he hadn't felt in years. The girl sat on the edge of the cot, brushing her hair with her fingers, waiting for the fire to settle. He knew then that she wasn't a visitor anymore. She belonged here now, and whatever trouble might come looking, he wasn't about to let it take her away. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 6, bringing in the first big storm, a harsh test of their teamwork, and showing how they hold the cabin together and keep each other warm through the night, deepening their trust even more? This is also where we can show her fear of losing this place and his quiet reassurance that she isn't going anywhere. The storm came hard 2 nights later, rolling down from the hills with a wind that howled through the cottonwoods and made the cabin door rattle in its frame. The cowboy had felt it coming all day, the air sharp enough to sting his teeth, and he had spent the afternoon cutting extra wood and laying it by the stove. When the first gust hit, he was already tying leather straps across the shutters and setting a quilt along the windowsill to block the draft. The girl followed his every move, her eyes wide. Clutching her blanket around her shoulders, he showed her how to bank the stove. Ash first, then wood on top. "Keep the coals alive," he said. She nodded, crouched low, and did as he told her, careful not to spill a coal on the floor. The roof thumped with sleet, and the wind made the lean-to groan. The mule stamped nervously. He pulled on his coat and hat, grabbed the lantern, and headed for the door. She caught his sleeve, her fingers tight. "I'll be back," he said simply, not yanking free, but waiting until she let go. He fought the wind all the way to the lean-to, soothed the mule, checked the latch, and piled extra hay to keep it calm. By the time he came back inside, his hat brim was crusted with ice, his coat dripping. The girl was exactly where he had left her, sitting on the floor near the stove with her knees under her chin. He hung the coat on a peg, knelt, and tipped the lantern low so the room felt smaller and warmer. The night went long. Every time the wind slammed the walls, the girl flinched. When the stove hissed, she jumped. He stayed close, showing her how to add a stick of wood without opening the door too far and letting the draft pull the flame. She copied him carefully, glancing at his face after every move. When she finally got it right and the fire caught, he said, "Good." She didn't speak but sat a little closer to the heat, her shoulders easing just a bit. Around midnight, when the storm was at its worst, the sound of sleet on the roof was like gravel, and the girl slid down from the cot to the floor. She didn't ask permission. She just sat cross-legged near the stove. He handed her the tin cup of warm water, poured one for himself, and sat opposite her. The two of them drank in silence, the stove ticking between them. "Will it break the house?" she asked at last, voice small. "No," he said, looking at the rafters. "Built it myself." "Hold." That seemed to be enough. She leaned her back against the bunk and closed her eyes, still clutching the CUP.BY morning. The whole yard was white and the sky washed clean. The cabin had held, just like he said it would. He stepped outside to check the corral, rails still up, roof still on the lean-to, and came back in to find her already adding wood to the stove without being told. She turned to him, chin high, waiting to see if she had done it right. "Good fire," he said. She nodded, set the poker aside, and sat down at the table as if she had been living here forever. That morning, for the first time, she didn't snatch at the food. She ate slow, stopped halfway through, and glanced toward the window where the snow still clung to the glass. "You staying?" she asked suddenly, as if the storm had given her the courage to say it. "Here," he said, meaning both of them, not just himself. She let out a long breath, quiet but deep, as if she had been holding it since the day he caught her by the fire. And when she smiled, it stayed on her face even as she went to fetch the bucket for water. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 7, where the first real threat arrives? A rider who questions whether she belongs there. And we see the cowboy's quiet resolve tested as he chooses to stand between her and anyone who would take her away. This would raise the tension and make the bond between them feel unshakable. The thaw came slow, one warm day followed by a hard freeze at night, turning the ground to mud in the mornings and dust by afternoon. The cowboy used the time to mend what the wind had broken: a rail on the corral, a loose hinge on the door, and the girl worked beside him, holding boards steady or carrying nails in a tin. She didn't flinch at the hammer now, didn't shrink from the mule when it passed close. She was part of the work, part of the place. Late one morning, he was hauling a bucket from the creek when he saw a rider coming along the fence line. Not fast enough to be a stranger passing through, not slow enough to be friendly. The cowboy set the bucket down and waited, hand loose near his belt, but not reaching for the colt. The rider pulled up near the gate, a rangy man with a weathered hat and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you got yourself a stray out here," the rider said, glancing toward the cabin door where the girl had stepped out, curious. "She's with me," the cowboy said, voice flat. "Funny thing," the rider went on. "Folks say she came through town weeks back, taking scraps behind the boarding house. Some might think she's up for the taking. Could be a man rides out and claims what's his." His hand toyed with the rein as he spoke, testing, baiting. The cowboy didn't move. "Paper says different. Clerk's stamp, judge's mark. She's under my protection now." "Paper don't stop a man from trying," the rider said with a thin smile. The cowboy stepped forward, closing the space between them until he stood square in the dirt with nothing between them but air and the sound of the mule shifting in the corral. His voice stayed calm, but carried iron. "Then try it here. Now." The grin dropped off the rider's face. He studied the cowboy for a long moment, weighing the risk, then spit into the dust and turned his horse. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered and rode back the way he'd come. The girl hadn't moved. She still stood on the porch, one hand gripping the doorframe, so tight her knuckles were white. The cowboy walked back, slow so she could see he wasn't riled, and took her hand gently off the wood. "Inside," he said. She obeyed. Stepping back into the cabin, he set the bar across the door before sitting down at the table. She hovered by the stove, watching him, her eyes wide and frightened in a way he hadn't seen since the first night. "Would he take me?" she asked finally. "No," he said simply. "Not while I'm standing." She looked at him a long moment, then at the bar door, and nodded. She went to the shelf, took out the folded paper from the tin, and set it on the table as if to make sure it was still there. He left it where she placed it, a silent agreement that it meant something now, not just words on a page. That night, she didn't sit on the cot to eat. She sat across from him at the table, her feet swinging under the bench, her face calmer. When she finished, she put her plate on the shelf and came back to sit again, just sitting like she wanted to be in the room with him a little longer. He didn't speak, didn't tell her to get to bed, just kept the fire going until her head tipped forward and she fell asleep there at the table. The cowboy picked her up, carried her to the cot, and covered her with the blanket. When he stood over her a moment later, he realized his chest had gone loose, the tight knot that had lived there for years easing just a bit. Whatever came next, he knew now that letting her go was no longer an option. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8, where spring comes fully and we see him make physical changes to the cabin, building her a rail bed, planting a small garden together, showing that he is not just protecting her for now, but making a life that includes her. This is also a good place to show her giving him a small token of gratitude, deepening their bond even further. Spring pushed in slow, melting the last of the snow along the fence line and filling the creek until it ran fast enough to be heard from the yard. The cowboy used the change in weather to get ahead of the work, setting corner posts, mending rails, and cutting new boards to replace the ones split in the storm. The girl stayed with him through it all, carrying nails and a tin, holding the level, and handing him the hammer when he reached for it without looking. She no longer waited to be told each step. She watched how he worked and moved to where she was needed. One afternoon, he planted a stack of good pine boards on the workbench. The girl stood nearby, arms folded on the rail, watching every stroke of the blade. "What's it for?" she asked. "Bed," he said, her mouth parted a little, surprised. She stayed quiet after that, just watching as he cut, measured, and set the frame together piece by piece. When the rope lattice was tied and the bed stood square against the wall, she stepped forward and ran her fingers along the smooth wood. For a long moment, she just stood there looking at it. Then she reached into the pocket of her old dress, pulled out the torn blue ribbon she'd kept hidden since the first night, and tied it carefully around the headrail. She stepped back and looked at him like she was waiting to see if it was allowed. "Looks right," he said. That evening they cooked together, the girl washing the green onions she had planted near the ditch weeks earlier, her first crop. She sliced them small and sprinkled them into the pot, her face intent. When she set the bowl on the table with both hands, he said, "Good work." She smiled without hesitation this time and sat down opposite him. After supper, she rummaged in the pocket of the shirt she wore now and pulled out a small brown button. "For the shelf," she said, placing it in the center of the wooden ledge he had built for her to keep her things. It was plain and a little chipped, but she left it there as if it meant something important. When night came, she climbed into the new bed for the first time, lying on her back and staring at the ceiling with her hands folded over her chest. "It's mine?" she asked. "It's yours," he said. She turned on her side, facing the stove's soft glow, and her breathing slowed until she was asleep. The cowboy sat at the table a while longer, listening to the quiet. The cabin felt different now. Not just a place to sleep and eat, but a place that had been changed by both of them. The broom leaned where she always put it. The boots sat by the door. The button rested on the shelf, and the ribbon caught the light when the fire flared. He looked around and saw that the room no longer spoke only of him. It held her too, her small work, her presence, her claim. And he realized he didn't mind. It felt settled. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 9, where we bring this story to a decisive, happy ending? The final trip to town where the judge confirms the guardianship. Gossip turns to acceptance, and the cowboy allows himself his first real smile in years, leaving no question that they have become a family. When the road dried hard enough to take a wagon without sinking, the cowboy decided it was time to ride into town again. Supplies were running low, but there was more to it this time. The girl had a bed now, a shelf with her button sitting neat in the middle, and the ribbon tied at the headboard. This place wasn't temporary anymore, and he wanted the paper to match that truth. He hitched the mule before sunup, moving without hurry, but with a kind of purpose she had learned to recognize. She came out of the cabin with her boots laced tight and the blanket folded under her arm, ready before he called for her. He lifted her to the wagon bench, set the reins in his lap, and they started down the rutted track with the sound of wheels bumping over the hard ground. The town was busy, wagons tied up along the square, men talking on porches, children running between the store and the livery. People watched as the wagon rolled past, and the girl sat straight, no longer hunching as if to make herself smaller. The cowboy stopped at the courthouse first. The clerk recognized him, nodded once, and took the folded paper he handed over. "You mean to make it permanent, then?" the clerk asked. "Yes," the cowboy said, his voice steady. They were shown into the judge's small office, lined with shelves of ledgers and a single window letting in the morning light. The judge read the paper slowly, then looked at the cowboy over the rims of his wire spectacles. "You understand this means you're responsible for her now. Schooling when there is any food, shelter, all of it." "Yes," the cowboy said again. It was a word he did not use lightly. The judge signed the page, stamped it, and handed over a copy. "Then that's that," he said. "She's yours." The girl reached for the paper, and this time he let her take it. She held it in both hands, staring at the black ink as though it was something alive. When they stepped back out into the square, a woman on a porch looked at the girl and said, not unkindly, "She looks better than last time." The girl's hand went to the cowboy's coat, not clutching now, but just resting there, as if she wanted to be sure he was still beside her. They made a short stop at the general store for flour, salt, and coffee. The clerk, who had once only stared, now greeted them with a nod. The cowboy bought a packet of sweets and dropped it in the girl's hands on the way out. She blinked at it, surprised, and held it tight all the way back to the wagon. The ride home was quiet, the mule's hooves knocking steady against the packed road. When they reached the yard, he lifted her down and watched her run to the onion row she had planted, checking the shoots that had grown taller while they were away. She came back to the porch and waited at the door because she knew now that some rules mattered. Inside, he set the ledger copy in the tin and closed the lid. She sat at the table, unwrapping the sweets carefully, offering him one before taking one for herself. When they ate supper that night, she no longer rushed, no longer glanced at the door. She ate slow, setting the spoon down between bites, her feet swinging lightly under the bench. When the plates were washed and the fire banked, she lay down on her bed and pulled the blanket to her chin, smiling at him before turning toward the wall. He stood there for a moment, looking at the ribbon tied to the bedpost, the button on the shelf, the two cups hanging side by the stove. For the first time in years, his face softened into a real smile, one that reached his eyes. The cabin was no longer just his. It was theirs now. Outside, the sky was still clear and pale when he stepped onto the porch. The mule stamped once in the corral. The sound of the creek reached him faintly in the night air. He closed the door behind him and latched it, knowing there was nothing left to wonder about. She was safe. She was his to keep. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was home too.